Welcome back to the Fourth.Trimester podcast, where we explore the postpartum experience through interdisciplinary, evidence-based perspectives. Today we'll be talking about something that's often treated as purely medical. We're going to unpack how the postpartum recovery is actually deeply shaped by social and cultural forces.
Exactly. When most people think of postpartum, they usually think about the physical recovery after childbirth. But what we found in our research is that postpartum is not just biological. It's social, it's political, cultural, and even economic.
And then we're going to explore three major themes today. We'll see first breastfeeding, and then public controversy, and then as well maternity leave and structural inequality, as well as postpartum practices across cultures, and how the meaning and power shape the experience of motherhood.
And we hope that by the end it's clear that postpartum is not universal. It looks very different depending on where you live, your cultural background, and your social position.
So let's start about breastfeeding, because it is one of the clearest examples of how culture shaped postpartum. There was a study conducted in the region of Tanzania, focusing on indigenous pastoralist women, primarily Maasai communities.
And what's interesting here is that breastfeeding there is completely normalized. It's considered natural, essential, and not optional. Women are expected to breastfeed soon after birth and continue for an extended period, and it's deeply embedded in their culture.
Right, and I think in those pastoralist communities, daily life is communal. And so the fact that women are often outdoors doing labor, herding, gathering, domestic work, and breastfeeding commonly happens in those shared spaces.
Yeah, for sure. And then what's key here is that breastfeeding is framed strictly as infant care. It's not framed sexually, and the breast is not viewed primarily as a sexual object in that context.
Exactly, and modesty is still important, especially in those cultures, but women are also expected to behave respectfully. Breastfeeding itself is acceptable because it's seen as a maternal responsibility rather than a bodily exposure.
Exactly, and then now let's compare that to Western cultures, where we examined in a quantitative study that in many Western societies, breastfeeding in public is legally protected, and yet it's socially contested.
Yeah, a lot of people have that controversy between the way it may be judged or seen. And so women in Western communities have described being really stressed about it. They report feeling exposed, judged, and anxious, socially vulnerable in these contexts.
And the controversy here isn't really about the baby, it's about the visibility of the maternal body in public. Western cultures heavily sexualize breasts, so when a mother breastfeeds in public, it disrupts that sexual framing of the breast, and that makes observers uncomfortable.
And so that's exactly where researchers describe as a conflict between these two identities, between the good mother who feeds her baby on demand or when it needs it, and then the modest mother where they avoid exposing their body in public areas.
Yeah, for sure. And then on top of that, women feel that they then have to breastfeed discreetly or properly without offending anyone. And what's powerful is that many women report feeling worry about what other people are thinking and about other people's comfort rather than their own well-being or their baby's needs.
Exactly, and that's actually where the real consequences happen, because some women then start avoiding leaving the house, and they have shortened breastfeeding duration, or some even experience increased anxiety and embarrassment.
Yeah, and this is especially a significant problem postpartum, because this is already a vulnerable time emotionally for mothers, because as we mentioned in a previous episode, identity is shifting and social support is seen as protective against postpartum depression. So if public stigma reduces mobility and it increases isolation, it can indirectly increase the risks of anxiety and depression postpartum.
Yeah, exactly. And so in Tanzania, breastfeeding is normalized, but mobility may be structured by postpartum seclusion. And then in the Western context, mobility exists, but the stigma really creates psychological barriers for women. So that contrast really shows how culture shapes postpartum experience.
Yeah, for sure. So now let's zoom out from social attitudes to policy, because maternity leave is another huge sociological factor shaping postpartum recovery. A global comparative study looked at 120 years of maternity leave development across 5 countries.
And then, yeah, exactly. And it's fine. But originally maternal leave in industrialized nations was introduced to protect women's health and safeguard infants. But it was only limited to the formal industrial workers in this context.
And then after World War II, welfare states expanded leave duration and wage replacement, and in the late 20th and 21st centuries, maternity leave became a global policy norm that existed, and the key issue here, though, is inclusiveness.
Exactly. And so in Europe, compared to other continents, they generally are known for having a strong protection and inclusive social insurance for maternity leave. A great example would be Denmark, which is known as one of the best countries for maternity leave and also infants for when they grow up. Mothers are entitled to 4 weeks before birth, and then after that, each parent gets about 24 weeks of paternal leave with parental benefits, but some of the weeks can even be transferred between each parent.
Yeah, so that significantly contrasts with, say, the United States, which has no universal policy for paid maternity leave, and instead it's left to be employer-based or unpaid at all.
And compared to other continents in regions like Latin America, Africa, and even parts of Asia, policies may exist on paper, but the high levels of informal employment mean that many women aren't actually covered.
Yeah, that's a big issue too. So then that also creates inequality. Educated, urban, salaried women benefit, but then rural, informal, or precarious workers are often unprotected from any of these policies.
And then the maternity leave affects so many postpartum outcomes. The physical recovery can be affected, breastfeeding duration, mental health, bonding and attachment, and even employment continuity.
Yeah, so inclusive leave policies can reduce postpartum distress. They can protect income security and improve maternal well-being as well. So postpartum isn't just shaped by family or culture. We can see it's shaped by state policy and also by economic systems.
Yeah, exactly. And then looking at postpartum rituals and meanings and power across different cultures, in a book of Childbirth Across Cultures, the idea was that postpartum is a biocultural event, and that it's not just biological recovery as we've seen previously. It's shaped by rituals, community norms, and even gender expectations.
Yeah, so cultural ideas determine how long postpartum lasts, who cares for the mother, what foods are appropriate, and what healing rituals are performed. For example, in Hmong culture, there is a 30-day confinement period in which new mothers use specific rituals and restrictions to support healing and community integration.
Yeah, and then similarly in countries like China and Korea and Japan, postpartum traditions are more emphasized, and they focus the rest and warmth and special foods and energy balance. And the focus is very mainly based on restoring the body after childbirth.
For sure, and then these policies and practices often contrast with biomedical postpartum care, which may involve short hospital stays and limited follow-ups.
So then when we look at traditional systems, they will also emphasize the seclusion, the community care, and symbolic meanings, such as ideas of purity and sacredness, and also the vulnerability after birth. But then when you compare those to the Western culture, it's a complete different shift of the approach to postpartum recovery is more medicalized instead of just having a holistic approach to things.
Yeah, definitely. So what's important is that postpartum is not just biological, it's not biologically uniform across the world, it's embedded in power structures as well. So things like who decides how long the mom rests for, who controls her mobility, and who influences feeding practices, for example. In some contexts, this may be the husband or elders or other community leaders who influence maternal decision making, and so women may not have full autonomy.
I definitely agree. And so the fact that postpartum becomes a site where they have gender roles and authority and even social expectation are negotiated. It's not just the woman itself.
Yeah. So then if we take a step back, we see postpartum pregnancy is shaped by multiple sociocultural layers.
Exactly. And these factors affect not just the physical recovery, but also the mental health, the identity, the mobility, economic security, and even social participation.
Yeah, so postpartum is not just a medical stage, it's a social transition into motherhood, and how that transition unfolds depends heavily on cultural and social factors.
Precisely, and the fact that when we talk about improved mental maternal health outcomes, we can't just focus on the biology part of it. We can also focus on addressing stigma and policy inequality and cultural expectations that exist.
Exactly, because ultimately postpartum is, and the care is shaped by society and just as much as it is by the body.
So thank you for listening, and we hope this conversation helped highlight how deeply social cultural forces shape postpartum experiences. See you next